Welcome back. Let's shift focus to the trade deal between the United States and China. In a post on social media, President Donald Trump said, and I quote, "Our deal with China is done, subject to final approval with President Xi and me." Trump wrote that China will supply the necessary rare earths to the U.S., while the U.S. will allow Chinese students in its colleges and universities. Trump added that U.S. will impose 55% tariffs as against China's 10% tariffs. But will the two countries have a lasting deal? To discuss this, joining us on the show right now is Brian Wong, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Hong Kong. Mr. Wong, thank you very much for being with us. Let me begin by asking you about the rare earth magnet issue. This is possibly the biggest geopolitical issue right now. Do you expect China to lift the export curbs for the United States completely, as Donald Trump is hinting?
Thank you very much for having me. I think much of this would inevitably turn on the extent to which the Americans are sincere and also committed in delivering upon their end of the bargain. Recognize that the weaponization of rare earths and also by extension all forms of strategic commodities is increasingly in fashion from all of the major powers and also regional powers across the world. America in relation to advanced semiconductors and also related manufacturing ingredients, China with regards to rare earths, and of course in the case of Russia and also numerous other players in the Middle East, you've got threats of withholding of oil exports and also LNG supplies. So this is a sign, right? These are signs of the times we're in right now. And I would say that whilst Beijing is in principle open to playing ball and open to lifting all of these restrictions, much of the extent to which it actually follows through on this would turn on when not Washington is willing to keep to its side of the bargain in relation to matters that Beijing sees to be geopolitically integral to its own interests. That includes, of course, fault lines in the South China Seas, over the Taiwan Straits, and on a more, distant level, perhaps its interests in seeing to that Chinese students, including ordinary citizens and civilians with no affiliation with the party apparatus, seeing to that they can have the rights to enroll into foreign universities and international universities in America respected. So that's what I would say the current state of play is really contingent upon, which is where not the Americans can be trusted to follow through and stick to their promises.
Right. 55% tariffs on US, 10% tariffs on China. How does this augur for the Chinese economy?
Yeah, very good. So I think you meant sort of 55% coming from the US side and 10% on a part of the Chinese vis-a-vis goods, or rather exports from the other party. And on this note, I'd say it's going to be tough. This short to medium term prognosis is it's going to be very tough on China, given its incredible dependence upon exports in several sectors, especially, of course, advanced manufacturing, higher end electronics, and of course many of the consumer goods that are not usually particularly welcome or embraced by the domestic markets. It's going to be tough in the next year or two. But here's a reason why I think ultimately these tariffs and trade barriers would benefit China. And that's because for a very long while, the Chinese have struggled to find sufficient political impetus and momentum, especially on the part of technocrats and administrators in the system, to make the case for a genuinely pro-consumption growth direction, for a growth direction that is not dependent upon China's ability to manufacture all these wonderful goods at extremely low prices and sell them off to the world, but instead to shore up the domestic resilience and ability of the Chinese economy to absorb such capacity. Now, with these trade tariffs and also protectionist measures in place, what we've seen effectively over the past 9 months is precisely folks within the Chinese system, who are more sympathetic towards a more comprehensive approach to growth, saying, look, guys, we've got to rebalance. Look, guys, we've got to diversify beyond leaning just into export and advanced manufacturing. And in the long run, such transitions or such transformations would be utile for the Chinese economy and the people at large. And that's for a number of reasons. One, investment-led growth had really reached the end of its runway in many ways, right? And two, it was far too geopolitically unwise for China to hedge all of its bets on export-led growth, given how easy it is for other countries to slap on tariffs and barriers and restrictions of all sorts that we've seen over the past 6 years. And three, and most fundamentally, what the Chinese economy most certainly would benefit from today is a confident and emerging middle class that not only consumes domestically made goods, but also imports more from the world, imports from, wonderful burgeoning economies like India, like Southeast Asia and ASEAN, and where with China, India, and ASEAN in conjunction and in combination with one another, we could very well see the rise of a new economic order centered around Asia, centered around China, India, and ASEAN, which is dubbed
Right.
by my very dear friend, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, to be the CIA countries, so to speak, of the world. And that is why, fundamentally, I think the reforms that China really needed to undertake at least a decade ago, finally, these reforms are coming, and we should be grateful that they're happening today.
What impact will US decoupling from China have? We have seen how significantly US imports from China fell down drastically recently, and this was at the highest level since February 2020, since COVID-19. How do you think this is going to impact the Chinese economy in the months to come?
Yeah, very good. If we look at the predictions released by Goldman Sachs from approximately 1.5 months ago, which really is too long by contemporary Trumpian standards, even it doesn't seem that long. The estimates had it that a 50% tariff imposed by the US on China, which is really where the currently effective rates of tariffs are, right? Around 51% also as we speak. A 50% tariff rate would cause a 1.5% drag on the Chinese economic growth rate this year. And if that's double to say 100, then you'd get an extra 0.9% drag, such that there'd be a negative 2.4% drag in total on Chinese GDP growth this year. And that stems from two major factors. The first being the significant sort of shocks, right, and the challenges encountered by domestic producers in China in relation to the withdrawn or withheld orders coming from the US. And the second reason being, of course, the dent on consumer and producer confidence, which if you look at the most recent Caixin survey that was conducted around 2 weeks ago, and the results came out shortly after that, they didn't look good when it came to the PMI, right? And that really is usually a fairly decent proxy for the extent to which producers are confident and optimistic about their economic trajectory. But again, I'll return to the point I was making just then, which is this pain in the short term offers a much needed galvanizing catalyst for the Chinese state to look at its long-standing structural challenges, which can be ameliorated, which can be fixed and addressed, but require them to actively bolster the living wages of the citizens, to improve the level of youth employment and the quality of jobs on offer, and finally focus on, in strengthening the welfare system and fostering a basic safety net allows for households to spend and consume confidently. I hope these changes are coming, and I'm cautiously hopeful that they will.
All right, Brian Wong, thank you so much for joining us here on Global Lens with your view on the US-China trade truce and the framework that has been agreed upon in London. Let's move on.